All right, we'll get started as folks are settling back in here. Hello again. It's great to see so many familiar faces today. Thank you all for coming. I'm John Eric Haynes. I am one of the co-lead symposium editors, and I'm extremely honored to be hosting our last panel of the day just before our fantastic keynote speakers, so I hope folks can stick around and hear them as well. So the topic of this panel is the future of police accountability and public safety. It's an incredibly important topic as we sit here in the city that sparked an international movement after the murder of George Floyd almost 2 years ago. So joining me this afternoon, we have Sheila Nazad, an organizer and activist with Reclaim the Block. Sheila co-authored the original Yes for Minneapolis Public Safety Amendment and recently ran an inspiring campaign for Mayor of Minneapolis on a platform of transforming the conversation around public safety. We have Minister Janae Bates, another local activist and organizer. Janae is a United Methodist minister who currently works as the communications director for Isaiah, a great interfaith organization. Previously worked as the co-lead and communications director for the Yes for Minneapolis campaign. And lastly, we have our own Professor Maria Ponomarenko, Associate Professor of Law here at the university. In addition to her important teaching and scholarship here at the U, Professor Ponomarenko is a co-founder and counsel of the Policing Project, a nonprofit-based NYU School of Law, a nonprofit based at the NYU School of Law that works to promote more effective police governance. So it is truly depressing that the topic of this panel remains as urgent and pressing today, less than 2 months after Amir Locke was killed by Minneapolis police, as it was in tumultuous May of 2022, or 2020. My desire is that in the face of such injustice, that this conversation can provide a small degree of hope that arises out of taking action to build a better public safety system. So without further ado, we'll dive into the discussion. To begin, I want to look back at some of the things we've learned since the George Floyd uprising. We'll start with just a general question for Janae here. In the spirit of finding some hope, we'll turn to the minister here and ask, how has this George Floyd movement transformed the conversation and opened up new avenues in the discussion around policing?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the most salient way that we found that it's been transformed is that we're having far more conversations about public safety like as a holistic thing, and recognizing that police and policing are a tiny sliver of public safety. And so being able to push that conversation is extremely important because for far too long, when people hear public safety, they equate that with police, which actually made no sense when we did a series of just experiments in community that also included police officers, where we asked them, what does safety look like to you? And literally no one, including police officers, named police in that beautiful, safe community. And so it's a beautiful thing that we can claim that as a real victory in terms of what happened last year with the ballot initiative, but also what we continue to see as we move in this next iteration of this conversation is that folks are getting more and more clear that policing and public safety are actually two separate entities.
Fantastic. So I want to talk a little bit about what successes specifically activists have had in this movement following the murder of George Floyd. So in other words, how has the grassroots energy translated into real change? And I'll direct that to you, Professor Ponomarenko.
So that's a great question. I wish I had a more optimistic answer. There's been small scale reform, but what there hasn't really been is any sort of transformation. So, if we look at the state level here in Minnesota, there have been some piecemeal efforts to, reform how officers use force, to reform certain tiny aspects of the accountability system around arbitration, for example. So there have been these sort of piecemeal reform efforts. The city of Minneapolis itself has done some work, again, internally to, rethink the sort of offenses that can lead to a traffic stop, to, again, rethink officer training. But it's all piecemeal. It's all around the margins. What we haven't really seen is the sort of both, more ambitious and more holistic reform that I think things like Yes for Minneapolis really represented, of really rethinking how we actually do public safety in the city.
Absolutely. So that leads perfectly to my next question, which is what are the challenges that activists have faced in transferring this energy into durable, lasting change? And I'll direct that to you, Sheila.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm going to flip it around a little bit and talk about actually what has worked. So I'm an abolitionist, and that means I've got a really long-term view of change. Like Mariam Kaba, who is a great abolitionist thinker out of Chicago, says, I'm on a timeline of 500 years. So the changes we're going to see year to year are going to be smaller. But what has worked is narrative strategy. So what is narrative strategy? This report that I have a box of up there, if you grabbed a copy, thank you, is a people's history of the Minneapolis Police Department. And the reason we wrote this report in 2017 is to change the story that's being told. Kind of like Mary was saying earlier, in that the story can be twisted to continue to benefit the criminal punishment system, continue to benefit those who profit off of incarceration, so on and so forth. We have to tell a different story before we can build what comes next. And so narrative organizing, this report came out in 2017 and offered the question, is there a different way for us to build safety than police? And what really do police actually do? And how is that different than what we see in TV, what we've been taught in schools, what we're told by our mayor and council and business leaders, or even our own beliefs, right? And while court cases can be overturned, while elections can be lost, what can endure among all of that is a change in the story that we tell each other and tell ourselves, right? I like to think of narrative strategy as like a sound wave, right? Sound wave can get around corners, can get through doors, whereas sometimes when we're on these one-off initiatives, right, that's like a light wave. It gets stopped when there's something in its way. So as activists, what we need to do is work on that long-term change, really getting to the root of why is something happening. And what can be a challenge is criminalization, right? There are some people who are still in court cases from getting arrested in 2021 on the freeway, right? And it just sucks up a lot of time and resources. And also not knowing our history is the #1 way that we lose momentum when trying to make change. So I encourage everyone who's doing anything, whether it's large or small, write it down. Write what you did down and share it with someone, because I promise there's going to be another flashpoint. There's going to be another group of young activists who are coming into the scene, and they've not been taught what's happened in the past in great detail, right? Because those who benefit from power and control try to restrict those stories. So maybe that was a bigger answer than you were hoping for.
No, I think it's important to talk big picture, definitely. I'm going to jump ahead a little, just kind of based on the conversation we've had thus far, and just ask, let's talk about kind of next steps. Looking forward, how do we maintain the momentum? What are the next steps following the Yes on 2 referendum defeat, which, close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, and, we want real durable change, but winning 43% on such a radical referendum question is no small feat in my view. And so I think there's hope in the defeat as well. So I want to think about what the next step is in that process. And I'll open that up to whoever wants to take it.
I mean, I would say, it's so funny. Every time I get to talk about what took place in Yes, a lot of times folks are coming with this notion of, oh, it really sucks. Like it didn't, it failed, you lost. And I'm like, no, we kind of won. And let me explain why I am in that mindset. One, because of what Sheila just named, like narrative strategy is real, narrative power is real, and especially for those of you who are in this room aspiring to be lawyers or are lawyers, right? You actually hold an immense amount of power when it comes to narrative strategy, which I know we'll talk a little bit more about how lawyers helped us out in that regard. But you know, as a narrative strategist myself, I'm constantly thinking about the words we use, how we use them, and how it's actually moving people down a path. And I can just very frankly tell you all in this room, in December of 2020, we ran a poll about who was going to vote yes on such a beautiful future of replacing the Minneapolis Police Department with a much larger holistic Department of Public Safety that was focused on public health. And we got 13% yes. 13. So to say 11 months later that we got 43, after the first time in over 60 years that the people of Minneapolis challenged the power of the police federation, it is unheard of. It's unprecedented. And so we won. And we continue to win, and we have to continue to claim that as we move forward, because the reality is that was just a moment in our continuum of history. And as we continue to create it, we continue to name what is actually taking place. We make meaning for those around us. And so, you know, there most certainly is going to be a next. When it's been also really frustrating because there are several reports and legal documents that have come out after November of 2021 that, quite frankly, I felt like if even one of those, it's like 6 now, I think we're on 6 documents and reports, if even one of those had come out in like October, we may be having a different conversation. I mean, and that's everything from the ways in which the police department has been using tools and technology for surveying people. The fact that, in fact, the Minneapolis Police Department has been overfunded and not actually utilizing the resources that they currently have, in addition to being asked to do a bunch of things that they actually shouldn't be doing and can't provide. Another report came out about the ways in which they've acted after the murder of George Floyd and the harm and violence that they caused across the public, and then the lack of accountability and transparency in those actions. All of the things that the Department of Public Safety was set up to fix, right? There's most certainly the murder of Amir Locke and all of the different circumstances around that death. I can just go on and on and on. The fact that there was a Supreme Court reversing the decision about what was going on with North Minneapolis residents who felt like they didn't have enough police officers, and then it was determined, in fact, they did. So there is a way in which most certainly law and politics and policy and organizing and narrative strategy and communications, all of these things get to work together to shape where we're going. And we all have a lane in that. And so being clear about what our role is and continuing to move in that trajectory and advancing it, regardless of what the big public, echo chamber is in that moment, actually just being hyper-focused on what your goal is and knowing that you will continue to have community who's with you, who's supporting you. Because the reality is, no matter how people voted in Minneapolis, whether they voted yes or no one could say that what we currently have is working. Not one. And every single person would say we have to do something different in order to move forward, which is an incredible inclination that we're at a place where we're ready to continue to transform. Yeah.
I think I want to get concrete on that point. What are the avenues going forward? It's still early days, I guess, after the referendum, but what are, the legal and political avenues towards taking the next steps towards changing the system? Because, like you said, 43% voted yes. A good number more want some form of change that maybe, wasn't reflected in that referendum. So I'm curious about what the concrete avenues are for making changes. I'd like to maybe direct that to Professor Ponomarenko, talk about some other avenues.
Sure. I mean, one thing I want to underscore is, the yes for Minneapolis referendum was suggesting a set of institutional changes, but in terms of the broader vision, a lot of that could still be implemented within even the existing structure. And so I think it's important to distinguish between the kind of shuffling around the responsibilities that the referendums could do, which were important. Like, I don't want to remotely down, but there's the broader vision of, who plays a role in public safety. A lot of that can still be implemented. And, one thing that struck me was, shortly before the vote, Mayor Foer coming out and saying, like, I have the authority to do all of this already, and we don't need now. We could be cynical about, where that was coming from, and surely there was, partly the desire to see the referendum go down, but, you actually had the mayor coming forward and saying, like, I buy into that core vision. And so I think one thing that can be done is actually, holding existing officials to it. If it really can be done within the existing structure, I think at least some organizing could be focused there on actually seeing folks live up to that promise. But, I could rattle off any number of reforms. When I talk to students about this, I often try to distinguish between reform and reimagining. And I think there's kind of a role for both, in the sense that, reimagining is, and the kind of yes for Minneapolis was really rethinking, who plays a role in public safety? How do we conceptualize public safety? How do we deliver it, including by not relying on police for all or at least much of it? But, at the end of the day, at least for the foreseeable future, I definitely operate on a much more short-term time horizon than 500 years. We're going to have armed agents of the state. And then the question is, what do we do to make sure that in the short run, they're causing as little harm as possible? And so, a lot of the work that I do is on the minimizing harm as much as possible. And there, I'm happy to talk about any number of kind of legal reforms that we could see at the state level, things we've seen other states do where, frankly, Minnesota just lags pretty abysmally. But that's, there's that part of it, while we're also at the same time thinking about, what a much more long-term, holistic, not police-focused approach to public safety would look like.
I definitely want to get into some of the concretes of those more short-term aimed reforms as we go forward. But a couple things that were raised from your response that I want to direct to you two. As regards our mayor's statements about supporting many of the sort of basic principles of the Yes campaign, do you think he's a legitimate partner in this? Is there room to push Mayor Foer to back up those words? Or, I'm curious, from an organizing perspective, is there room to push Mayor Foer to back that up?
Yeah, so I recently served on Mayor Foer's community safety work group, which was charged with reviewing policies around transforming community safety to provide recommendations on what he should adopt in those changes. And I resigned from the work group after 2 meetings. And this is because the work group was asked to meet behind closed doors. We were not allowed to share out anything we talked about. The public was not allowed to observe discussions about the future of public safety. And we were encouraged to communicate with one another, making sure that we did not include anyone with a City of Minneapolis email address on our communications, because it would be subject to public data's requests. And that was per Mayor Foer's instruction. So if you think that's a good foundation for transforming public safety, I won't even be sarcastic. That's how it operationalized. And I really tried hard to get the group to open up to a public process like they did in St. Paul, and they refused. So I would say, in terms of concrete steps, number one right now in Minneapolis is maintaining transparency, or pushing for transparency, right? Journalists are under attack, and I need to verify this, but I am pretty sure that the newest MPD contract that was ratified yesterday had a provision in it that if someone submits a data request against an officer, their name is given to that officer.
Yes.
And here's the number one thing about police reform and regulations and policies on policing is that police break the rules all the time. So we can make more rules, but they will continue to break them because the system is not was not established to protect all of the people in our communities, right? So what we can do is reduce the harm, right? Reduce contact between police and community members to provide alternative ways of addressing violence and harm. And I don't think in this moment that happens within the city enterprise. Saying, as someone who ran for mayor, I've done a lot of reflection. I think that this moment is a time to study dual power and see how we can build our own resources outside the system that will be robust enough that they can avoid co-option when it comes to go into the system. I'll stop there.
Interesting. Great. Well, I'll try and get back on to, we've gone a little afield from the agenda that I distributed, but I will try and circle back here. So I think, we've talked a good amount about kind of the movement and where it's at. I want to maybe circle back into how attorneys can support and work with this movement. So how have attorneys been involved in the local police accountability movement following George Floyd?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my experience, I've worked with a lot of lawyers with the NLG, who have been wonderful in helping folks who are arrested in protest cases, and also were very helpful in the early days of thinking about charter change. So if there's some obscure area of city law, like charter law, that you are somehow interested in, let me encourage you to look into it, because what we found was very little people knew the ins and outs of charter law, and lawyers played a key role in us being able to imagine that level of system change. And I think lawyers have also helped us bridge into the system in a way that it's not like these crazy activists in the street, right? When a lawyer's around, sometimes people take you a little bit more seriously. And for me, it has also provided a little bit more, helped me be a little braver in speaking up and going into the streets, because I know movement lawyers who will have my back if I do get into contact with the legal system. That's what I can think of right now.
Great.
I would, just to add, there's many layers to the work that we're doing around movement. And so most certainly, things like the lawsuits and petition collection and, all of those detailed pieces, but also like labor laws and, oh my goodness, what's it called? I thought I had wrote it down too. Campaign finance laws, Lord Jesus.
Yes.
Just the many layers in which, quite frankly, folks who, have been really embedded into like a right-wing way of thinking, just to be really frank, they are well-versed in campaign finance laws and they know all of the loopholes. And I think a lot of times in progressive spaces, we are just trying to tick every single box and do everything so perfectly. And there are ways in which I think we lose for just not being willing to break enough rules. And that's a reality. And so having a legal team who is like both ready to think strategically and be strategic partners with us, and not just being completely risk averse, right, is an invaluable skill.
Great.
If I can actually just jump in on that, because that picks up on something that actually I have a question for the two of you. So, students will come to me since I teach criminal procedure, and like the number of times I get the question of like, I want to do something around policing, what do I do? And an answer I actually often give is to think about supporting all of the different alternative organizations that would be, delivering different kinds of public safety. So, it's actually really hard in some ways to plug in on the sort of, wonky policy reforms that law students typically think of, but it's, providing whether it's, support on the campaign finance side or providing, basic like employment law support to a small nonprofit that's working with youth after school. I mean, you could really kind of name any number of, concrete legal needs that are tangible, accessible, things where students can plug in and have really meaningful impact. It may not be quite as sexy as like I'm going to design the new policy on X or Y, but I think it's hugely tangible and something to think about. But if I can just ask a question, like, so students who come to me, like, how can they plug in those sorts of ways? Like, I see the need everywhere, but what are kind of tangible ways that where you've wished, like, man, it would be really nice to have some law students maybe with the supervision of an attorney somewhere or something.
Yeah, I mean, most certainly. So, as you had named, I work for an organization called Isaiah. We also have a C4 called Faith in Minnesota. And so often we are asking questions and like organizing strategy, conversations like, okay, but can we do this? Like, is this a step outside of that? Thinking about even when you're talking about nonprofits, like a C3 versus a C4, what can they do? What can't they do? And it is expensive to call a lawyer into that space to be like, hey, we got this question. Can we do this? And so it'd be great to be able to field that through a first layer. So, there are many, many organizations like mine, also including mine, if you want to join in, who, we have leaders who do have some training in that background and can at least give us that first layer. So, I mean, because really a lot of these, like, especially the like smaller ragtag orgs, we don't even know the right questions to ask. And so if we had other folks who have similar value sets and foundations as we do, and they're thinking more with like the legal mind of, okay, well, maybe we can do this, probably can't do that, but here's something we could do. Just always having that, like, here's how we can do this. Just that person in the room so that we know, okay, here are the questions that we can still have and that we can ask when we do need to pay that astronomical amount per hour for the lawyer to get in the space.
Yeah. In my campaign, I worked with several lawyers to help me develop my policy platform around decriminalization and protection of protesters and public safety. So I would say if folks are interested in dreaming as big as you can dream and find a candidate who's inspiring to you, just reach out. Because I'm not a lawyer and I learned so much about the ins and outs of the city attorney's office that I frankly would never have the time to learn or maybe energy. But it was really helpful and helped me dream all the ways that we can intervene way before someone is facing a prison sentence, say, in terms of decriminalization. And I think that is one of the number one things we can do right now in terms of policing is actually working on getting drugs and sex work and homelessness decriminalized within the city of Minneapolis.
So as we're on the topic of lawyering, there was some creative lawyering by the opponents of the Yes on 2 referendum through various legal challenges to the language of the referendum itself and things like that. How do you feel like that legal maneuvering affected the campaign?
It actually helped. Okay, so all right, so for those who didn't get to follow the wacky world of legal challenges during the campaign, we had a total of 4 lawsuits, and then lots of things in between, and you lawyers in the room know what all of those different briefings and just so much. Just for context, our legal team let us know when they gave us our bill that the amount of work that they had to do for our organization in the 5 months that they were with us was equivalent to what they did for 2 years prior. So yay! But also, it was an immense amount of work, but it worked out in our favor. And here's why: you cannot ever undermine how much law and politics are interrelated. And it came up every single step of the way in this fight. So when we initially when we initially actually entered into the legal challenge realm, it was actually our organization that did so, because the city council members and the mayor were most certainly in a big political fight around this question, of course, because they were all also running for office at that time, and they had all dug their feet in on if they were a yes or no, no matter what the question itself said. And most certainly, many weren't even considering what it actually did. So what we found is that the mayor and unfortunately at that time the city attorney and a few other council members who were absolutely against the question wrote in a very, very, very long, what it's called an explanatory note, and also in legal terms, a interpretive note into the ballot question. And so it very clearly put a thumb on the scale. And you also have to remember, all this is happening not just while this question is up for question, but also all of these people are up for office. And so that means, especially we had the mayoral apparatus running against us, and they're running polls, but so are we. And so we, both sides know, here are words that freak people out. Here are terms, here are things, here are situations that will make people way more open to the idea of transforming the police department. Here are things that will not. And so, of course, each side is trying to make sure, how are we actually saying this that actually makes it as even-handed and objective as possible. And what we found is that the explanatory note was filled with all of the things that make people terrified. And we challenged, of course, this question with this very long explanatory note. And initially, the judge ruled in our favor, saying that the explanatory read like a warning label. That was literally what the judge named. And it was long, y'all. Oh, it was paragraphs long. And all of this would be on someone's ballot when they're trying to make a decision. So you also have to remember, me as a narrative strategist, I know and have studied how people make voting decisions. People will not read that. They'll just be like, that sounds terrifying. It's like you watch a TV show and you see a lady smiling, just take this pill. And then you hear this man in the background whispering, you could die. No, right? So we challenged it. We won that suit. It went back. They removed the explanatory note altogether and then let the question go through without an explanatory note. And then the other side challenged that. And then the judge ruled in their favor. So then it went back. And then we went back again, re-challenged. And then this time, it became very clear that, we didn't even challenge this the third time. A team of corporate developers actually challenged, which really showed the hand of who had stake in this particular play, right? And so anyway, very long story short, it became abundantly clear that this was actually not about the question. It wasn't about making it as clear for voters to understand, which I promise to goodness, as a clergy person, that was the good faith argument we were in. We really wanted this question to be as objective and clear for voters as possible. But by the time we got to the third suit, it was like, oh, this has nothing to do with the question. This is just them trying to run the clock and drain our resources so that this question gets pushed off the ballot altogether. And of course, they very starkly revealed that hand in the fourth suit, where they asked the judge to completely remove the question from the ballot altogether, saying, oh, the voters will have plenty of time to think about it next year. And the judge did do that. Also, another layer to that, I'm sorry, this is very long, but another layer to that is the largest paper in the state, the Star Tribune, which has been publishing very, very favorable things about the sitting mayor, and also pretty heinous things about our ballot initiative. On the day before this judge makes their ruling, they put on the front page this glowing review of this sainthood of a woman, of a judge, on their front page above the fold. It was seemingly bizarre, but most certainly not coincidental. And so this judge ruled that the ballot question, in fact, should be removed. And because they had already gone to print, this is literally 3 days before early voting started. And so because it had already gone to print, people would get with their ballot a little piece of paper that said, if you vote on this question, it will not count. This was such a clear slap in the face of democracy. It wasn't even about public safety anymore. This was about the fact that a campaign had done everything that we were supposed to do. We checked every box. We said, okay, well, we'll try to get this through city council. That didn't work. Okay, we'll do a petition collection. Oh, we need 11,000 signatures. We're gonna go get 22,000 signatures. We checked that box. And it was like, okay, well, we gotta get a good question. Let's work on the question. We are checking boxes, spending money, getting lawyers, and still we're told, no, you can't vote because this very, very rich group of corporate developers said no. And they have this beautiful, wonderful judge who also didn't get named all of the horrible, heinous things behind that, but I'll digress. So we took it to the Supreme Court. And we took it to the Supreme Court, we challenged it, and we fought with everything in us, making it very clear this was an issue of democracy, that the people of Minneapolis deserve to have a say about their public safety system. And we won, literally 24 hours before the folks of Minneapolis were able to vote on that question. But it garnered an immense amount of support. So when we looked at, for example, the polling that took place right beforehand, where folks were a little more on the fence, we were very clearly winning right after the decision was made. Because the decision was made and blocked right at the same time. And so people were like, oh, I didn't know about this question before, but the fact that like these super rich people are just trying to take the decision from me makes me feel enraged, and I should do something about this. So very long-winded way to answer. Yes, it did do great things for the campaign and added a new breath of life to it because people take their democracy really seriously in Minnesota.
A legal saga for sure.
Yeah.
I want to save some time for questions, but before we do, I do want to quickly touch on, circle back on some of the specific shorter term sort of harm reduction that we were talking about before, and just give you a chance to highlight a few examples of some concrete measures that are being considered.
Sure. So I'm going to go in a really wonky law student direction, just knowing my audience here. So those of you who have taken Crim Pro either with me or with somebody else and left the class thinking, man, this really sucks. So there are a lot of things that legislatures can do to basically rewrite the rules that govern what it is that police can do during encounters, who officers can stop, what they can do during a stop. So a number of states, so Virginia passed a statute, Oregon most recently as well, basically saying like officers actually can't pull you over for a broken taillight or any number of low-level offenses, that actually officers need to have some more serious reason for a stop. And so that's, one very low-hanging fruit way to reduce discretion. Those of you who remember from Crim Pro the rules around consent searches, where basically officers get to ask permission, they don't have to tell you you have a right to refuse. A number of states have started to move away from that. So in some states, officers actually just don't get to ask for consent at all. They need probable cause in order to ask for permission to search, or at least something less like reasonable suspicion. And so there's lots of ways, and I want to encourage those of you who, again, are kind of thinking in the more policy domain, all the rules that you're learning about in classes like criminal procedure, those are all up for grabs, and there's lots of room for, especially state legislatures, to move in a much more protective direction, in a much fair direction that actually, rebalances the imbalance of power. It's not going to remove it. There's always going to be a huge imbalance of power anytime you have police officers interacting with members of the public. But there's a lot of kind of just, technical, wonky, law student friendly ways that those rules can change. And so that's at least one that I'll throw out to start.
Great. So I'll open it up to questions. Folks are welcome. I have this mic, so don't go to that one to avoid the feedback issue. But You can go to that mic, otherwise use the QR code, and looks like we have at least one here.
Oh, before that, I just wanted to add one more thing to that. Right now at the legislature, there are a number of bills that are up, particularly in the House. So Representative Athena Hollins is pushing for a true ban on no-knock warrants. You may have heard Mayor Foer say that actually existed, but then recanted and said, oh, as a matter of fact, it doesn't. So there is a ban on no-knock warrants that is at the House right now. Also, there is a very robust public safety bill that was written by Representative Cedric Frazier that is also being heard at the House. And so most certainly every person in this room, regardless of where you live in Minnesota, you can call your legislature and call your senator as well and push them to have a companion bill in the Senate. Because the Senate has been, unfortunately, blocking a lot of things. So there's like a very long list of bills in the House right now around public safety, around expanding public safety, around putting some of this $9 billion surplus that the state has into funding communities so that they have things like mental health treatment. They have great performing ways in which to fund community-based programs that actually have been proven to lower issues of violence and crime in communities. And then the Senate, unfortunately, the only bill that they have heard is to put $1 million into billboards that show that cops are good people. So we have a ways to go, but you can most certainly call your senator and call your representative, whether they're with you or not, to let them know, hey, this is something that I really care about. We need to put some of this funding into our public safety systems.
Fantastic. So this seems to be the question of the hour in this space, so I appreciate whoever raised it. So one of the factors that seemed significant in the no vote was the fears of individuals who live in areas that are affected by crime and violence regularly. How does the movement bring them into this vision for a police-free future when these legitimate fears exist? I'll open that up to whoever would like to take it.
Okay, two things. Number one, voter turnout. Who knows a little bit about voter turnout in Minneapolis? Raise your hand. Yeah, I see you. You door knocked, you know. So voter turnout in Minneapolis is hugely disparate based on area, income, and race. So in, I don't know this last year's numbers, but in the 2017 municipal elections, more people voted in Ward 13. I think it was something like 20,000 people or more. And Ward 13 is Southwest Minneapolis, so wealthier, whiter area of Minneapolis. And in Wards 4 and 5 combined, I believe it was 6,000 people voted, right? So if you say black voters in North Minneapolis, or black people in North Minneapolis did not want this, think about who's voting and who also lives there. And what role does disenfranchisement play into who gets to vote, right? Or who, my campaign was the only one who knocked every precinct in the North Side, because most campaigns say, oh, there's not a lot of voters out there, we're gonna spend our time in Southwest, right? So first of all, you gotta get the full picture of the data. And yeah, actually, I'm gonna stop with that and pass it to you, Janae, with the.
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. And it's also important to note all these wards have about the equal amount of residents. So it wasn't like Ward 13 just had a bunch more people. But the other thing that's really important to know when you're talking about communities of color, most certainly Black communities, and those, I mean, drastically under-resourced, especially when you're looking at Minneapolis, the reality is, just as Sheila named, one, it was not a huge amount. Like, the story that tries to get told is like, Black people in North don't want this, which actually was not the case, right? We were door knocking in North just as, even more so, if not just as much as we were in Southwest, for example. But the thing that really did and most certainly continues to be a thing that we have to grapple with, is the misinformation and disinformation about what we were actually doing. Because what the ballot campaign was actually trying to do, and which we still should and continue to try to do, is to create this holistic model that actually incorporates community input, community buy-in, and community engagement in our public safety system. The thing that police officers get to offer, and they always do, is give us money, we'll give you this package that says safety, right? And then we open the box and it's never in there. And then they're like, oh, because you got to give us more money. And so what we didn't want to do is say, here's a package, safety's in it. And what we really wanted to do was be able to build community into that. And so we were working with Black communities, but also like organizational communities, like community-based organizations who have been doing, violence interruption, who have been doing things that are about connecting and relationship building and ensuring that families are safe and, knowing who are the perpetrators and also who often tend to be the victims of gun violence in communities with these higher levels. That's actually who should and continue to should be the center of the conversation. But unfortunately, because of the very large echo chamber of mis and disinformation, especially in this particular campaign where it all became, they want to take all your police. This is about abolishing police. I want to tell this really, really quick analogy that I always think is really helpful about what happened in this campaign. Because the campaign became so much about either you're going to defund the police or defend the police, and you have to choose a side. And most certainly I admire folks like, Sheila, who's like, I'm an abolitionist, and that is exactly what she's going for. And she's talking about this 500-year vision. But on this campaign, we didn't have 500 years. We had a couple months, right, to be able to build something that actually keeps people safe. That was the point of it. And so we ended up getting embattled in this conversation about abolishing the police and defunding the police, which is terrifying people who are in their very real lived experience hearing gunshots outside their house, right? And so what we were feeling was imagine there is a person who all their life, all they ever had was rice. That's all they ever been offered. That's all they've ever eaten. Technically, the human body can't survive on rice alone. Rice and water, if that's all you had, you would survive. But you will not be healthy. You'll be drastically malnourished. Now, a group of people come up to them and say, look, if you say yes, we will get you some fruits, some vegetables, some proteins, help to gradually get that into your diet so you can get to a place where you're healthy. And then another person who has been supplying them their rice the whole time has says that, no, they're coming to take your rice. That's what this is about. They want to take your rice. They want to starve you. And that, unfortunately, that became the conversation. It was always about taking rice, or no, we need more brown rice, or no, we just need to test the rice better, make sure that it doesn't have as much arsenic as this rice. But we're like, no, there's a bunch of other things people need to be whole. And so that became the conversation. And when you're talking to a bunch of people who've only survived on rice, it can be terrifying. Right, and so that's where we were, but I do think we've moved a little bit farther. We've moved the needle a little bit.
Fantastic, yeah. I want to, on thinking about that question of how to transform a system into a more holistic view of public safety and a more, democratic view of public safety. I want to turn to you, Professor Ponomarenko. I read some of your scholarship talking about sort of the administrative control structures of policing. And I'm wondering if that, if you see that as part of that conversation, that looking at a more, changing the system as a more holistic way.
I see it as like a really small part of the conversation, not to downplay the work that I do, but, I think, policing is a little bit unique in the way that we regulate it. So, if you think about most kind of public functions, there's just a lot more public involvement in deciding what that looks like and overseeing it on a day-to-day basis. If you take something like a school board, right? Like education, you can't imagine telling parents, actually, you don't get to know what happens in your kid's school. People would go apoplectic, right? when it comes to policing, though, like that's exactly what we tell people is like, you don't get to know, this isn't for you, we have it, just like trust us. And so I do think there's like a much broader kind of culture shift that needs to happen around democratizing policing, around increasing transparency, around providing access, kind of no longer assuming that the people who have the guns and badges actually know how to deliver safety and that like they're the experts. We have this idea of police expertise that is on an incredibly thin foundation. And so I do think that that is part of the story, which is we've really taken control of policing away from the communities that are policed. And so like that has to be part of how we rethink it.
Fantastic. Well, we're running out of time here. I want to thank our panelists for participating in this conversation. It's been fantastic. Thank you for making this day a really fruitful conversation. So I hope folks can stick around for our keynote speakers coming up. And we'll give everyone a minute to grab a cup of coffee or run to the restroom before we move ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.